Lanniko Lee imachiapi. Naha iuha. Chante washdeya. Nape chiuzape. My name is Lanniko Lee, and my relatives, I shake your hands with good feelings in my heart. Today we're going to be learning a little bit more about one of our elders who's no longer with us, but this is part of a project that is much larger, so let me explain. This is the second in a series of podcasts devoted to hashtag Native Reads. It's a collaboration effort between the Oak Lake Writers Society and First Nation Institutes. Oak Lake Writers Society is a tribal writers organization with more than 30 Oceti Sakowin writers and scholars, and First Nations Institute does fine work all on behalf of our indigenous nations. The goal of this collaboration is to nurture and strengthen the Oceti Sakowin literacy, that which has existed for centuries, but is relatively inaccessible to our communities. As a result of these of colonization projects and programs in our communities, we have had lots of state and federal government projects and communities that have made it relatively difficult for us to have access to much of our own literature. The other influence being the efforts of the um, Christian church systems, and all of it with the purpose of acculturating our people. Many of the books that are a part of the Native Reads um, top 10 list from a survey given um, of the people who have participated in a survey, many of those are not on public library and public and private libraries. Some of them are out of print and some of them are not available. So that's one of the reasons why we want to revive this Chetty Shakoi authors and the works that they had done over the long history of published works by them. Books of novels, essays, short stories, and poetry. We have sitting in with us today Dr. Sarah Hernandez Sichango Lakota, who took it upon herself to develop this Native Reads campaign for Indigenous literature and literacy. She's highlighting this long legacy of writings for our people. She's taken a great deal of work upon herself in addition to what she does for her professional work. The other person that is with us is our um, technical person, Nick Estes. He's the Red Nation podcast technical person. Nick is also an Oak Lake writer, and his book, Our History is the Future, was selected as the recommended one book of the 10. So we'll be talking about the 10 books and the future discussions on this campaign will be on Red Nation podcast. So in his discussion with Patty Bordeaux Nelson in the second installment, Joseph Marshall III, Sichango Lakota author, explained a lot about what it took to get published. What it takes today is just as difficult as what it did back when the early writers of our people were contributing to this literacy. Joseph emphasized the dedication that it takes to become a student of writing and publishing, and he said it's a very challenging journey. So we're going to learn about all these as we go through these 10 books. But what we can say across the board for all of them is that they were witness to the passing of so many of our elders. And with that happening, much of our cultural history was going to be lost, especially when reservations were created for where we were to live. So it behooves us to embrace the important works of Joseph Marshall and many others who have stayed the course to keep our history, culture, and language alive and accessible, because publishing has made it really accessible. Those who can and will write will strengthen this literature and the literacy, and they themselves are all descendants of the keepers of the oral tradition. So hashtag Native Reads is providing a budding renaissance of this cultural literacy, and hopefully it will strengthen our Indigenous authorship as well. Oak Lake Writers is all about nurturing that part, because now this might not happen at all this time around. We'll have to schedule that at another time, but there are annual writers retreats for the sole purpose of spending a week together and discussing issues and many kinds of traditional concerns we have that are not just present but future implications for ourselves. Because we all know that reservation life has radically changed the way in which history events have been kept by our people. And we want to share that in traditional ways. And some of that is going to take the shape of publishing. So, having said all of that, we wanted to say something that I know may not be understood by some of the people listening here. Though there are three dialects to the language, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota, these writers are one in that they're all members of the Ocheti Shakoe Oyate, the Seven Council Confederacy, people of the Seven Council Fires. So we feel that the hashtag Native Reads is an important way to keep strong and vital the ancestral and contemporary voices of who we are. You can find a lot more information about this literacy campaign at firstnations.org/Native Reads. So in this episode, our discussion will focus on Ella Deloria's fictional account of pre-reservation life from a woman's perspective. It is a story that spans the lives of actually three women, but one being the main character for which the book is named. Waterlily was born into the White Ghost Camp Circle, or Tioshpaye. The plot of the novel follows her life from birth through age 22. During that time, we learn through her about the complexity of women's life during pre-colonization, the expectations that were made of her by her family, as well as the entire Tioshpaye, the camp circle. This entails skills of making and keeping a balanced family life, something that we all need to be attentive to, which our guest is going to talk about a little later. So in her own words, this is what Ella Deloria had to say about that. She said the women's work was this. They packed every bit of household equipment each time the camp moved. They alone guarded all these things during the march. When they stopped to make camp, the women again unpacked everything alone and erected their teepee. They laid out all the bedding. They gathered and brought in firewood. They brought water. They cooked. They passed out the food. They took care of all the children. They used all the utensils incidental to managing the household. They even made the teepees. They themselves dressed the robes for their teepees. They made all the bedding. They were entirely in charge of all the food once it had been obtained and brought home by the men. End of quote. So it's this that we see Ella Deloria bringing to the work of the early anthropologists, one of which she worked for as an assistant scholar. Ella used the novel to show the life of the elder as well. In it, we see Gloko, who illustrates for us and illuminates much of the spiritual groundings that are manifest as her thoughts and practices. The elder Gloko is the mother of Star Elk, Bluebird's husband. Bluebird, the mother of Waterlily, exemplifies what can be described as a trial of married life, whereas Waterlily exemplifies what was deemed a life of honor as we see her growing into womanhood, ultimately leading to a life of fulfillment and ultimately a marriage of a love marriage. So this novel is not only a love story, but it's also a really creative portrayal about the lives of women before colonization. On reflection, we can see that it serves as a sharp contrast to the imposition of reservation life after colonization and the creation of reservations. So to the degree that work of Ella Deloria and her story Waterlily has had lasting consequence, we look at the author's life and writings and how they have played a significant role in the work of our guest. We are privileged today to have our discussion to share with We're privileged to share today our discussion with Faith Spotted Eagle. Will you introduce yourself and tell us about what you've been doing with this book?
Ohamitakyapi, my relatives, Yupiakid, Yushke, Napetiusapi, giving you a virtual handshake. Deampetuki, Ihangtua Oyanka Ekta Wa'u. I'm here on Ihangtua camp territory. De Ukorakichia Oapa, He Chajeta ki Chanteo Hitikia Ukorakichia. I belong as a member of the Braveheart Society. And we have a lodge here, Oti Wanji Uyuhapi, Che Yupiakit Dakuku Iwowa Gadakingta. So I'm going to share with you whatever direction my hosts want me to go in regard to this wonderful discussion about our relative Yupiakit Wa'u Pipi. We are very lucky that she preserved a glimpse into life that is hard to emulate, but it makes us lonesome for it, and that gives us the motivation to restore it, enhance, and recreate those spaces where our young ones can again benefit from that beautiful civil life that we had in the Oyanke or the camp. So my Dakota name is Tonka Inajiwe, Standing Stone. I carry the name of my great grandmother who was an exile from Minnesota. She was a survivor of Whitestone Massacre, raised by my Kushi, her daughter, who was born in 1872 and died in 1976 when my oldest child, was born. And so I come from probably 300 or 400 years of oral history through my Kushis, and my aunt, who was my father's sister, lived to be 104. So I'm hoping with all those mileage genes that I can attain that wonderful age, but we shall see.
Oh, that's wonderful. So Faith, tell me, what has been your earliest memory of Ella Cara Deloria? Can you tell us
Um,
what that memory, how that came about? This is really fascinating what you're doing.
I remember they always called her, well, depending on the kinship address, but she was known as Tui because as she describes in her writings, Tui means birth mother. So the aunts, which is what Tui means, were designated by the code of the language that they were the ones that helped give birth to, they were midwives. And so she carried the name Tui, but she gave birth to a different kind of, I guess, legacy, which was her what she preserved in her mind in writing. Although she did not have children, she played a special place. And my earliest memory of her is a number of them when she would come out to my grandma and my grandpa's. We lived in Old White Swan. I still have the land there, even though the river destroyed much of our community. We were fortunate enough to have land up on the plateau, so she would always come to our house and she made her daily rounds or her annual, whenever it was. But I do remember her coming to the house several times, and I was a little girl. And she, of course, grandma would say, I remember one particular time when she was coming and the dogs were barking and everybody was excited that somebody was coming, and and in our language she said, "Ake wiaki wichazo ohina uki wana u." She said, "The woman who always carries the pencil is coming again." So wichazo means pencil. So they chidingly called her that she was always carrying a pencil, and so then you had to kind of pay attention to what you were saying when she was coming because she'd be writing it all down. So they kind of teased her about it. And I remember my grandma saying that, and then her coming in. And of course, when I have a memory like that, I can smell soup and coffee and oven bread and everything else. Those mixed memories that are imprinted on my mind, all mixed together in a good way. But first of all, I remember her eating, them feeding her. And she was a thin woman. She was, well, she seemed tall because I was a kid. I don't know how tall she was, but that's my earliest memory. And then subsequently, I would see her throughout my life. And I remember her being connected to my grandpa Deloria, Grandpa Vine. He would always come out. He was a frequent visitor out to my father because they were close. And so Grandpa Vine was kind of a connector or a bridge with her and Uncle Vine and everybody else. The main connection was Grandpa Vine. But people came and went, and it wasn't like, oh, it was, her writings were not published at that point, or maybe they were written somewhere, but it wasn't a point of conversation. It was just relationship, kinship, family, visiting, feeding, um, being happy to see each other. And then my sisters, who are older, went to St. Mary's School. And we, of course, are all Episcopalian. They call them Ska'o, the ones who wear white, because they wore the white robes versus the black robes. And so they went to St. Mary's. Like my sisters that are, let's see, one is 7 years older, one's 3 years older. They had her as a teacher at St. Mary's School. So they had her in an academic setting when she taught there for a while. But she was just kind of a common thing when I was young, coming and going. And then I remember a story. There was an old guild house down at Old White Swan, and it was the guild house that was attached or that was located near Old St. Philip's Church. St. Philip's Church still stands, and they moved it up to Lake Andes. But that house down there, Grandpa Deloria lived there, and I think all of the siblings lived down there, but whoever was the minister at the church down there lived in that guild house, and they moved it up to Lake Andes in the maybe 50s. And I remember in later years with my aunt, the one who died maybe 5 years ago when she was 104, we went to church on Easter, which was a big day for putting out the food bundles. She was looking over at the house and there was a porch on there and she was having a memory and she said, uh, the older ones, of course, were always telling stories like I'm doing now. And she said, "Oh, I remember." She said, "Tojan Ella Gasuzi, Nina Yokshichapi." They were really sad because they had heard that Grandpa Deloria had a stroke, and that was her father. And so they were sitting on the porch and they were crying on that. And that house was still down at White Swan. And so that memory always stayed with me. Whenever I'd look at that porch, I'd visualize Auntie Ella or Grandma Ella. They called her Auntie probably because she didn't have children. But Tui Ella and Susie sitting there always had that visual picture of them sitting on that porch crying for Grandpa Deloria. But yeah, there were just, stories that would pop out. She kind of had I remember too, one of the aunties talking about she kind of had a shrill voice. It wasn't shrill, but she kind of had like a high pitched voice because she was so excited when she was talking all the time. Probably because she was so dedicated to getting all of, I can't even imagine how her mind and brain must have been, because when my brain gets filled, I stress out and I think, oh my gosh, I got to get this all done. And just think, our culture, our Odakota was changing before her very eyes and her heart. It must have been really tough. So all the more gratitude to do what she did in times of the passing of a culture.
Yes, true. Now, I was just, as you were saying, thinking or talking there, I was thinking to myself, here was a woman who, all the literature, when I was reading through all this, because I didn't have the privilege of knowing her in the way that you have, um, it's all recorded that she was never formally trained as an anthropologist, but yet she was assistant to one of the most famous, that Franz Boas. She had this to say about that, and so we can. I wonder, like you say, you're interested in you're thinking about what kind of mind she had. So we also have a little bit of a reflection of what kind of personality she had too when she said this. At Franz Boas's birthday, he was 81 years old at that time. She said to him at that birthday, "I would not trade the privilege of having known you for anything I can think of." And she addressed him always in respectful terms, calling him Father Franz. So we could see just from that little snippet there, she um, must have had an idea that with the Christian influence in her life as well, these people come into our communities, into our lives, and they took the hold of our, what would you call it? They came in and filled a role of like a leader in a particular settings. So she had this kind of rapport with him,
I think
and
that
she
there was another perspective is that a lot of our entire society, meaning our Dakota society, was age graded. And so because he was older, according to age graded society, that he was like a father. So it may have been the father Christianity, but I think it was also that he was an older man.
yes, yes. So that brings whoops, I'm getting a so that brings me to something that has always bothered me about that relationship, and I'm going to just put it out there because I think maybe it might serve me well to hear what you think about it. But this she worked very hard for this person, this friend who was. They had a close working relationship, and when I think back of what the man was spending all his time on, was this incredible body of knowledge that was a part of this growing this new field of study, anthropology. And what was she doing? She was recording and collecting uh, what had previously information that this James Owen Dorsey of the Smithsonian Institute, he was an ethnologist, and so his work and Francois's work was focused on the Sioux culture and the language. And at that particular time in our history, American history, there was this budding academic field. There were a lot of people on the reservations doing what Ella was doing, collecting and recording information. So some of those individuals, Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict and people like that, when I think about that, I think to myself, um, here, here were, I- I'm going to put it out there, they were informers to the culture of, to a body of newcomers into our world, and they were informing about our lives. And so when I thought about what was she sharing? She was sharing all about our tribal ways, everyday family practices, camp circle organization, leaders in our community, knowledge of the language. Great deal of it was spent on the ceremonial activities, and oh man, so much more. But on the other hand, as we're thinking about that, I couldn't help but wonder at that time, one of another young person, George Bush Otter, was also a young tribal cultural informer, and he and I think there was Ivan Starr, uh, people like him from they were they were also not being paid anything for any of the work, and so some of them I've later learned were had their work um, published in the language in Lakota, and one of them was a priest. This Eugene Buchel, uh, priest. Lakota Times and Texts was one of those examples. Now I went online to try to find out more about uh, the archives that were supposedly the manuscripts and archives of Ella Deloria's work, because I had heard, just in talk with others, that there were manuscripts that were set aside in that Dakota Indian um, works that he wrote in Dakota. So there you go. So I'm wondering um, why I just have a hard time trying to figure this into this um, discrepancy of what she's giving and what they're taking, how the anthropologists are making great strides in this new academic field, and yet there was very little that came back during those early times to our people. Let's put it that way, because I did not have the family relationship as you have with Ella, but how wonderful that it was she had this novel that she was able to put it together and finally get it published in 1988. So that that has always been a disturbing discrepancy. So what I want to ask you a little bit about her career. Did she ever talk about her work?
I think that, again, the relationship that I had with her was as a little girl. And so, from listening to what my aunts and my grandma said, one of the things that they did talk about is that they had compassion for her. In our language, it was more like our language is codified. So when you translate a word, it has a lot of behavioral meaning, and it touches on all the quadrants of emotion, physical, spiritual. But they said she was a person who had wowashi, uh, um, like she really had a lot of compassion for what she was doing, that it was part of her heart. But at the same time, they could see a discrepancy where she was very mushika, like she was poor, and that she was always, they knew that she always needed resources to be able to pursue what she was doing for our people. They very well understood that what she was doing was important for us, especially the women, because she spent a lot of time with the women. And because she respected the kinship relationship where she wasn't going to be barging into a bunch of men without some kind of protocols in place, like with my grandpa's. But she spent a lot of time with the women, and the feeling that they had was that she always was barely getting by, and that she was always, they worried about her being hungry, and they would say, well, she's thin, tamayacha. And so they had a woman's compassion for her, that she wasn't supported by whoever it was that was wanting her to do all of this stuff. And they didn't know his name, and they didn't know he was an anthropologist, but they could sense through spirit that she was uh, not respected. And so they really would like give her things, like when she'd come out to the house, then they'd bundle up a bunch of food and whatever else. And, if she needed help with gas or whatever. And we didn't have a lot of resources, but we were pretty self-sufficient as far as food and resources, like being self-sustainable. So there was always plenty of food to give her. And then the other thing that I remember in the relationship is that they knew that she always put her family first, that she always made a place for Susie, her sister. So I never really understood. I just vaguely remember meeting Susie, but she was really, in our language, Wiestecha means a person who holds themselves kind of back, afar, not so much like in your face. But she was, and so everybody understood that she was a very shy, reserved person. And even as a child, I could understand that. I could feel that. So I didn't even want to stare at her or anything, because I didn't want to like hurt her if she didn't like to be stared at. I mean, you just inherently knew that as a child when those protocols were in place. And they're not nowadays. But and I really had some insight once. Uh, Cousin Philip, young Philip Deloria, he gave me that book that he wrote on Susie. It's called Becoming, I can't remember what it is, but it's recent. And when I saw him about a year ago, he gave me that book and I read it. And it gave me great understanding into the tremendous amount of commitment that Tui Ella made to take care of her sister, to support her sister. But even though wasn't aware of that, everybody, you understood those behaviors and those feelings as a child, that she was a special person to be taken care of. And that's what Tumi Ella did.
Okay. That's amazing to me how we have those in all of our families. We always seem to have someone who is going to take up the role. I've in my own immediate family, we have somebody who's like that, you know.
Yeah. And then she also did that for her father, because um, she always filled in for her siblings, and she took care of, the immediate family. She was still fulfilling the role of a matriarch. And I remember the other thing that my uncle Phil told me, who would have been her cousin, I believe. But Uncle Phil Lane told me a story that Grandpa Deloria, after he got his stroke, he wanted to keep young Philip home with him, because he felt like he wanted to teach him all he could remember. And he said that was his school. And so, in the meantime, the authorities, like the boss farmer and everybody, apparently, and that was probably during the 20s, that they were telling him he had to send his grandson to school. And Uncle Phil was telling me this, and it's on a recording somewhere, but Grandpa said, you got to go to school because they're pressuring me. So he went to one of the country schools and he looked at it and he came back and he said, Grandpa Deloria, I don't want to be there. And he said, okay, just go look at it every now and then so I can tell him that you went to school. And so when Tony Ella came back and she was kind of chiding Grandpa Deloria that why isn't this boy in school? And so Uncle Phil said he was getting worried because he knew something was going to happen. And Grandpa said he does go to school. And she said, where? And so she went and checked, and all he was doing is he'd walk to the school and turn around and come back. So he was going to school. But she took him and sent him to Haskell. And so he was separated from Grandpa. But before he went, Grandpa asked him to take him down to a medicine man down below White Swan on the Missouri River. And apparently he said he was a little boy. He was around 7 or 8 years old, and they had those old Model something, Model T or Model A, and he was too little to reach the driver's seat, so he had to sit on a pail. And he said he drove Grandpa Deloria down there because he had that stroke. And he went down to this medicine man, and he told him that he would try to help him. So they went to ceremony, and they did those things in the daytime. He said it wasn't dark. He said it was a ceremony in the daytime. And the Waapia Wichasha, the person who helps, told him, he said, I can't basadoha. He said, I can't fix it. I can push it back for you to live along. Basdoha means to push back. I can push it back for a while, but he said they are wanting you to go home. So I can push it back for a while for you to do what you need to do before you leave. So Grandpa Deloria understood that, and Uncle, as a little boy, he said, I remember realizing that Grandpa was going to leave. And so we had to hurry up and take care of things. And so and then when Grandpa or Uncle Phil was sent to Haskell, Grandpa Deloria made the special arrangements to tell the boys' matron down there at the dorm that when he died, he had special instructions for Uncle Phil once that he passed on. And so Uncle Phil said that there was a time that he was in the dorm, and this matron or whatever they called him, the counselor or whatever for the dorm, came and got him, and he said, I have to take you somewhere to tell you something about your family. And he said he already felt like Grandpa had gone, but he took him out in the field. And back then, I guess Haskell was not as citified. And he took him out in the field, and they sat down, and he said, your grandpa had instructions to you for me that when he died, he wanted you to be told out here on the earth by yourself, because he said he knew that Grandpa said that would make him feel good, to be like, it would be like being home. And so then he told him, and then he told him, he said, I have to go home. I have to go take care of my grandpa. And the guy said, no, you can't. You're a little boy. You have to go back to the dorm. So he took him back to the dorm. And then he said that night he remembered the moon came out, and he fixed like a little hobo. He said, and he started laughing when he was telling me. He said, I saw a hobo somewhere, so I did that. He said, I put a little wapakta, a little scarf together of some food. And then he said, I sneaked out of the dorm, and the moon was going to help me because it was shining. And so he headed out. And he said somebody must have saw him because they caught him the next morning, and because he was going to go home for Grandpa's funeral. And so they caught him and brought him home. And he said the most wonderful thing that always stuck in his mind is that when they marched him back to the dorm at Haskell, he said these little tiny girls were like little women. They knew that he had tried to escape to go back to his grandpa's funeral. And they were all standing in a line in front of their dorm, the girls' dorm, and they all started to lee when they brought him back. Isn't that a beautiful thing
Uh,
to? And he said he felt brave, and he said that helped me. And he said I was going to cry, but those little girls were standing there leeing me, and he said they made me strong. But
there.
just think the foresight to prepare him for the time when he left.
It reminds me of the fact that we have a whole different way of looking at death in our in the cultures. We have um, we need to remind our young people about the fact that death is very much a part of life, and so therefore we have need for those preparations still. So let's take some time now to turn our attention to the novel. So at the very beginning, the opening of the novel, Waterlily's mother, Bluebird, is faced with some challenges of her own. She's married to Star Elk, and the marriage isn't going well. But Deloria uses this marriage to begin opening up her story about these traditional values that we know of. That overarching status of marriage provides that framework for understanding kinship rules. That overarching status of marriage provides the framework for understanding kinship rules, and also the consequences of keeping them or violating those rules. So in this novel, we have a lot of that pertaining to how the marriage is the center of this, how the family is at the center of it. Would you be kind enough to share some thoughts on how Deloria, Ella Deloria, treats this topic?
Of marriage.
Yes, and also these kinship rules, because remember we learned that she's we're told that in the book that it's a dangerous time, when one is thinking about marriage, or there is this business of coming together for a family, making a family.
I know we have a limited amount of time here, and we're running out of time because I think I have an hour with you. So I think what I'm going to do is try to, if you don't mind, to summarize the ways that Waterlily moved our direction with Braveheart Society. Do you mind if I do that? And I can link in a lot of that because we're going to run out of time. Do you mind?
Oh no, correct.
Okay. So having known Auntie Ella and Tui Ella and those strict kinship rules that you talked about in that beginning entry in her book, I grew up with those. So when I read Waterlily the first time, it really made me lonesome because we looked at the text of Waterlily in Dakota, up at the Dakota Indian Foundation back in 1994. What year was Waterlily published? Do you remember in its form?
1988.
Okay. So it had not been published for a long period of time. And in 1994, we came to a good and wonderful place in the Black Hills where we began to do some trauma work and bringing back a ceremony called Naliki Chopi. And this was before even the word historical trauma was coined. We knew that a lot of our people were not standing in full spirit. And so, after a healing retreat in November of '94, a bunch of us who were older, and some of us weren't grandmothers then back in 1994, but we realized that the good medicine of our Odakota or our culture was the only thing that could restore the lack of spirit, and that we indeed have to have our call our spirits back. And so we began to talk about all of the teachings that we had and how lonesome we were because it wasn't being those behaviors of kinship and respect and being modest about your body and being ready and knowing what kind of partner to look for. We could see that a lot of our girls with the high teenage pregnancy, the sexual molestation, the rape, all of that was terrifying at and such a high rate. We thought the only way we could do this if we go back to who we are as a people. And so once we read Waterlily, a lot of that was so familiar to us because again we grew up with that, and I can pull out some things that speak to me. One is that when she talks about in the book about when they're in the teepee and people are not talking loudly and harshly because you have ultimate respect for people's space. And so when I was growing up, and my grandma would go to the grocery store with me, and remember, she died when she was 104. So I was used to being around real old people, and she was like in her 80s and 90s, and we go to the store, and she'd always have that demur or that behavior. She'd say, "Takoja, be proud of yourself. You are an important child. Nitue, you're somebody. You don't have to act like you have no brain." She said, "You are a really smart girl." So I had this dialogue going in my head all the time about how special that I was a beloved child, and that I didn't need to screech. I didn't need to holler in front of people, and I didn't need to embarrass myself because I knew who I was. So I was thinking about that in the book when she talks about that, is that you're very aware of other people's space and you respect that with the tone of your voice, and you with the way you look at people. You did not stare at people. And I remember my aunts when their father-in-laws or different, the whole kinship system would come together out at White Swan. They would keep their head down and they would look at the ground. And I now look at my daughter, who is getting her doctorate degree in anthropology. Somehow she incorporated that behavior. She's very much, grew up in an urban reservation era, but she has that behavior, and somehow it transcended the generations. So even though She wasn't a strictly speaking Dakota, she got the behaviors. That is just truly amazing to me because when I watch her, she acts like my aunties. And I thought, how did that happen? Because sometimes we don't have the environment where we can sit down and say, okay, this is what you're supposed to do. This is how you move your eyes, but it becomes a behavior. And so the other thing, one of the things that spoke to us is there was a passage in her book where she says, I am not afraid. I have relatives. Isn't that just an absolutely beautiful? I've seen a quote, I've seen it on memes. She said, I am not afraid. I have relatives. And so, what that meant was that the positive side, no matter what, somebody always that was there to love you, to encourage you, to say good things about you, and to be good to listen to. And the opposite of now in growing, which is why we do what we do in Braveheart, is that because we didn't learn the behaviors with that were connected with the language, we have gotten carried away with family where we only speak to our family, we only take up for our family, and we dislike anybody else who is not part of our family. Can you see how that happened? Because there was a glitch in the culture. And so when you read the book, it's very important to explain those behaviors. Early on in Braveheart Society, one of the young ones, how many of we have 159 girls who've gone through the coming of age ceremony through Braveheart camps, and that's a lot. And so they are our future. One of them told me one time, she said, Kunshi, when I grow up, I want to do what you all are doing. And I said, what is that? And she said, bringing home the culture one by one. And so she said, how can I do that? And I said, why don't you do a book club or something and start with Waterlily? So she did, and we bought enough books for Waterlily, and there were about 15 that started it, and that was such an emotional exercise because when they would read the passages in Waterlily, they would travel back in time, they would discuss it, they would mourn it, they would yearn for it, and they would grieve it. And so it took forever to get halfway through the book, and the poor little Takoja that was doing the book club, she said, I'm never going to do a book club again. It took them months to get through this book. But what they were doing is they were grieving the loss of their culture. And so at the end of reading Waterlily, we had a ceremony, and she is Auntie Tui and Susie are buried here at St. Philip's. And so we made a special meal for them, and we made coffee. She likes sweet coffee with cream in it or milk. And so we took it out to them, to her grave, and they were able to cry and thank her for what she preserved that could be transferred to their heart, even though she was no longer here. That was very, very powerful to go to her grave and for them to mourn the loss of their culture and the realization that they could, and some of them have read the book several times. But what we realized is that it's almost like a reminder and a guide because there are those of us that still have those actual memories that we can create spaces to relive those type of experiences that will impart the same kind of behavior, like not shrieking at each other in the grocery store or imparting those behaviors of respect. So that was uh, the impact, and out of that Braveheart has continued to grow. We're 25 years old, and we try to emulate as much as possible the in our language. In the Lakotas they say wo Lakota, us we say o Dakota, and it's the same concept, is that it's a feeling of peace. Dakota means like peace or friend, and it's how you impart that feeling of goodness and sacredness and secureness, safety. And so we continue to build. And I don't know if you want to ask some questions or talk about what we've done with her teachings, but we have 25 years is it could be seen. I know different people measure generations in different ways, but we could say that we have raised a generation because by the time a girl is 25, she probably has her own children. So she's starting another generation. So we have impacted at least 159 young girls throughout the Ocheti Shakoi with the coming of age ceremony. The other interesting thing is that I heard Joyzelle Godfrey talk adamantly that Auntie Ella Tui said that the Ihangtwa did not have Ishnati. And I would, Auntie Ella, forgive me for disagreeing with you. I know in my kinship system we did, and the only way it could have been imparted to me is through the oral tradition and the knowledge that we did because it came down through our family. So I don't know if that was protection because you know how sometimes we didn't want to expose things that we needed to protect. If I ever could have had a grown up conversation with her, I would have loved to do that. So that's one of the variances that I never understood. But I know in my Ihangtwa family, which had other dialects in it, we did do that. So, and there were probably not everything could be included because she was one woman trying to include so many different things. But now that we've impacted several generations, my daughter, who grew up in Braveheart Society, is kind of walking the path of what Auntie Ella did. She is getting a doctorate in anthropology at the University of Washington, and her master's degree, which was in cultural heritage and anthropology at the University of Montana. She wrote her thesis on Braveheart Society and the role that societies played in Dakota culture and how important it was. And a lot of that was based on the things that was preserved by Tui Ella and other elders. There's a lot of them. She's not the only one that we've been able to incorporate into reviving this society and which is still in existence. And so that is online. Her name is Brooke Spotted Eagle, and she's also doing her dissertation on the Braveheart Society, which is an extension of her master's. So it's come a long way, and she's not the only one. There's other girls.
That's wonderful. Lila washte. Washte chila. Okay, we've arrived at the point where I'll have to say this, though, to everybody listening. Faith and I have preserved intact the body of the work of Waterlily with all the highlights that Faith has given. So now you can take up the grand adventure of reading about this. The only thing that I wanted to mention here was that as far along as what has been happening with the use of this book would be one I think has a future if it was translated into our language, because
Right.
I think that would be the next step in taking the
Can
book.
I can I
Go ahead.
say something real fast about Waterlily Storytelling Institute? So one of the things that we realized is that we grew up with all these beautiful stories. In fact, I have written a book about the mouse beans. The children's story will be my first book, but we realized that we had all these wonderful, delicious stories to guide us, and that a lot of these families did not have those stories. So 15 years ago, we initiated the Water Storytelling Institute, where we would have 3 nights and 4 days of nonstop stories. We'd have contemporary stories, we'd have spoken word, we've had Toshka, Frank Wan, Tanaya Winder. We've had all forms of people telling their stories. We've had Iktomi stories with Jerome Killsmall, Earl Bullhead, and we cooperate with the schools and the college and the surrounding area. But the main thing is for our people to realize that those stories, we are the people that the stories tell. So if we don't tell these stories, we don't know who we are. And so we are going into our 14th year. No, it's the 15th year of Waterlily. And that is such a delicious visiting time because one of the things that my grandma and I believe Tui Ella talked about it is that when a storyteller came to White Swan, it was really an honor for the family who would host a traveling storyteller. And so everybody would rush to their house or their lodge during the night when the fire was going, and those stories and the different news, maybe something from winter counts, would be told. And that was an esteemed person who was able to host them. And so we created that kind of setting at Braveheart Lodge where we build the fire, we provide delicious food, and then We put buffalo robes out in the night, and then during the day, it might be at the school, it would be at the lodge, but we just pack in as many storytellers that we can. And so that's how we revived the inspiration from her, and we named it after Waterlily.
That's amazing. That's amazing and wonderful. And we need to have more times to talk about this. So I'll have to come down.
Yes, yes. When we get through this sacred time that we're in with this threat that we're living with, we
Yes,
will return to Waterlily strong.
that would be wonderful. So I will say to you, Faith, thank you so much. Pilamayaye.
Huh.
Thank you so much for sharing what you have with us today. I want to encourage all the listeners that are still listening to visit your library or get a hold of the Water Lily book and have your family reading sessions together. Discuss what's going on in these books. You know, there's also study guides available for all of these books and more. Go to Native Reads. Oh, it's firstnations.org, Native Reads, and you'll have all of that accessible to you. So I thank you again, Faith, and we'll have to meet again.
Okay. Thank you. I'm really honored, and thank you so much.